Hello, everyone. This is a revision booster session looking specifically at supply side policy, which comes under the paper 2 on the AQA syllabus. In this revision presentation, I'm going to explain to you what supply side policies are, and then we will look specifically then at a different range of supply side policies, notably looking at privatisation, education and training, lower tax rates, trade union reform, reduced business taxes, and the concept of deregulation. I will explain what each of these are, look then at specific lines of analysis for each of these policies, and then we will evaluate each of these policies and look exactly at how each policy helps to helps the government to achieve their macroeconomic objectives. So if we look at what you need to know for the exam, you need to know about the advantages and disadvantages of supply side policy. Why are these good? Why are they not so good? What are the unintended consequences that come with investment into these supply side policies? In particular for AQA, the examiners have asked that you know about investment in education and training, that you know a bit about what happens if the government's lower direct taxes, lower taxes on business profits, trade union reform, and privatisation and deregulation. You will also need to then revert all of this back to how do supply side policies, how are they used to help achieve government objectives. So by definition, supply side policies focus on the production and supply side of the economy to increase potential output and achieve long-term economic growth. Supply side policy looks at increasing the capacity of a country. A country will look at what can we currently produce at using the resources in our economy. What is our current level of production? And what can we do to increase the quality and the quantity of those resources to further increase growth within the economy? As I've mentioned, they focus on increasing the quantity and quality of factors of production. So look at your different types of factors of production: land, labor, capital, enterprise. What can we physically do to increase the amount of land? How can we build more factories, for example? What can we do to increase the quality and the quantity of labor? How can we get more people into labor markets? How can we improve the quality of those who are currently in the labor market? So we're looking at improving the quality and quantity of those factors of production in order to increase the supply side of the economy. We also want to look at institutional changes intended to improve the productive capacity of the economy. Institutional changes are looking at changes possibly in the public sector. How can we change possibly from public sector to private sector? How can the public sector benefit from the advances or the disciplines of the free market in the private sector? There are two main categories for supply side policy. We often look at interventionist policies and we look at market-based policies. Interventionist policies, as the name suggests, they rely on government intervention. They rely on the government coming in and often providing money to increase the capacity of the economy. Things like education and training, for example, the government will issue grants and subsidies for young people to go to university. They'll increase funding for schools, for example. They'll invest heavily in training schemes where we see skills shortages in the labour markets. A market-based approach is an emphasis on the importance of well-functioning competitive markets in achieving growth and potential output. Things like privatisation, where the government would possibly sell off a publicly owned company to private shareholders in the intention that they would help to increase competition in that industry. So you can look at interventionist approach or market-based approaches. In your final evaluation, you would talk about, it would depend upon whether the government should introduce an interventionist approach or should they introduce a market-based approach. So policy 1, privatisation. Privatisation involves the transfer of ownership of a firm from the public to the private sector. This can increase efficiency due to improved management and operation of the privatised firm. So this is an example of where the government for years has publicly funded a public organisation. That organisation has been funded by the taxpayer. We pay our taxes, the government take those taxes and they run that industry or that company. Privatisation then basically involves the government saying, we no longer want to have ownership of this firm. It was once owned by the government. It was once owned by the taxpayer. We are now going to sell that government-owned asset to the private sector. They sell to private shareholders. An example would be the Royal Mail. So a number of years ago, Royal Mail was owned by the government. It was a public organization. It was funded by the taxpayer. The government realized that there were significant inefficiencies with Royal Mail. And one of their strategies to improve efficiencies was simply to sell it to private shareholders. When you sell a company to a private shareholder and it's sold to the private sector, you take on the profit incentive. The profit incentive encourages firms to be more efficient because private shareholders will say to directors, you need to do what you can to improve efficiency because we want to maximize our returns. We want to maximize our dividends. We can't afford for there to be any wastage of money. We can't afford any inefficiencies when we're investing in this company. The public sector is less incentivized to be efficient because the government can often be quite slack. They're not in it to make profit. They're there to run it in the interest of the public sector. This is based on the argument that government enterprises are often inefficient as they have bureaucratic procedures, they have very high administrative costs, and they have unproductive workers. Often they have unproductive workers because workers feel that their jobs are secure. They feel as if the government will always employ them because the government simply needs them to provide this public service. They do not face incentives to lower costs and maximize profits. If you own a private business, you're out to make as much profit as you possibly can. If you work for the public sector, you do not own that organization. And therefore, no matter how much profit it makes, you're only going to get a set wage every month or a set salary every year. You don't get bonuses really in the in the public sector, but you do in the private sector. If private sector workers were motivated by a bonus, they would be more inclined to be efficient. The private sector may therefore be more efficient than the public sector because of that profit motive or the profit incentive. The UK economy has seen significant privatisation activity since 1979, especially for the transport and utility industries. We've seen a large number of what was once publicly owned organisations then being basically sold off to the private sector. And it was the emphasis on the free market, the disciplines of the free market. It was the private sector, the profit motive. It was a drive to improve efficiency. And by selling off to the private sector, it meant that we as the customer could still use that company, but we could benefit from the efficiencies of it being a privately owned organisation. Evaluation then of privatisation. Privatisation is liked by conservatives. However, there are a number of issues with privatisation. First of all, it depends upon the nature of the industry in question. An industry like telecoms is a typical industry where the incentive of profit can help increase efficiency. However, if you apply this to industries like healthcare or public transport, the profit motive is less important. If you think about it, if TfL, Transport for London, had the incentive to make or maximize profits, you would have to pay a very heavy price to get to and from school every day. The government realized that, particularly in London, a large number of school children use buses to get to and from school. If the prices to travel to and from school were very high, then that might stop some of you from being able to come to school because maybe you wouldn't be able to afford it. And so therefore, the private sector can exploit or abuse customers in that way. If it is still owned by the government will always have the objective of maximizing the benefits and welfare of society. It depends upon the quality of regulation. So what often tends to happen is that when the government do decide to privatize an organization, they will put in place a degree of regulation to make sure that once they do privatize that company will not, now that it's privatized, extremely exploit the consumer through things like higher prices. If you take, for example, the Royal Mail, the government still own about 30% of the Royal Mail. And that was intended to make sure that they do continue to have a say to make sure that the privatized company does not exploit the consumer. Creating a private monopoly may harm consumer interests, but if the market is highly competitive, there's greater scope for efficiency savings. We like the idea of privatizing a firm to open it up to the disciplines of a competitive market. The more competition there is in a market, the more there is an incentive for firms to make sure that they offer the consumers the best possible quality service. Policy 2, then, we're looking at education and training. Now, this is a relatively easy one to get your head around. And it is quite similar to that of what you would have looked at with fiscal policy. But education and training is designed to look at investments into human capital. More and better training and education lead to an improvement in the quality of labour resources. If you go to school, if you go to college, if you gain a degree, you're becoming a more educated person. Therefore, the skills that you have, you will be put to better and more effective and more efficient and more productive use when you go into the workplace. Highly educated people contribute a large degree to high levels of productivity in the economy. That high levels of productivity, that high levels of education and training, that brings with it a higher level of wages, a higher level of pay, and the government can benefit in the long term through things like increased levels of income tax, more people in employment, for example. Labour is a factor of production. And going back to the definition of supply side policies, remember that supply side policies are all designed to improve the quality and quantity of factors of production. It is not just the quantity of labour that affects an economy's ability to produce, but also the quality of that labour. Every day you're in school, you're adding quality to yourself, you're improving and adding to human capital. You will remember, as I've said on a number of occasions, you are and always will be the most valuable asset you will ever own. And every day in school, every time that you go out and educate yourself and take on board those opportunities, you're adding more value to yourself. The better educated and trained the workforce, the more able it is to produce goods and services, and therefore more supply in the economy. If you've got a more efficient and more productive workforce, they'll be producing goods at a faster rate. There'll be less mistakes, there'll be less wastage, and therefore by producing more, you're increasing the supply in the economy. Education has many positive externalities. Governments spend a lot of money, they spend billions every year educating young people to get them into the labour market so that they contribute towards the next generation of workers. Public training and education programs can assist workers in becoming more employable. The higher your education and skills, the more employable and attractive you will be to your future employer. Education is a barrier to entry and qualifications are a barrier to entry in labour markets. Firms will look at the idea that they have more educated staff, therefore you have to have high levels of qualifications. Those that don't have those qualifications will not gain entry into the workplace. Specific measures include setting up retraining programs for structurally unemployed workers to obtain skills in greater demand, assisting young people to pursue education and training through grants and subsidies. So giving young people grants, subsidies, bursaries to go to university, for example. So rather than them having the excuse of, I don't come from a very well-off background, therefore I wouldn't be able to go to university, the government step in and say, here's a grant, here's a subsidy. This will help reduce the financial burden of educating yourself. If we look at retraining programs, we look at structurally unemployed workers who have been unemployed because there's been changes in the labour markets. The work they were originally doing, they've been made redundant because that work was no longer demanded. So you take, for example, the coal miners. The coal miners were made redundant because there was no longer a demand for coal. What the government should have done or should have invested more in was looking at what could have been done to help the coal miners retrain in industries where there was growth, in industries where there was a rise in demand and therefore there would be a rise in the demand for labour. Let's take these workers from this industry and train them up to be able to enter into an industry where there is evidence of growth. So evaluation of education and training. First of all, it's a very costly supply side policy. Think about, roughly you're looking at about 60 to 70,000 to put you through state education from reception right up until the end of year 13. The provision of education and training is a very labour intensive service industry with the associated wage costs. Think of the amount of money that keeps the school running. So some, schools run, the government gives every school millions every year to operate the efficient education for young people. The costs of education and training can be very, very expensive. And it is an industry where there are teachers in every classroom. There are teachers teaching young people. They require a wage that has to be paid. And of course, teachers are very educated people, and therefore the wage rate reflects their level of education and skill set. There is a time lag with education. It will not increase the supply of the economy straight away. Education and training is very much so a long-term strategy. It's one where it will take years for there to be an increase in the quality and quantity of the labour force. The recommendation is that if it is costly and if there is a time lag, the government should focus on a particular market. For example, provide increased training where there is skills shortages. So rather than just invest in every educational sector, universities, primary schools, secondary schools, further education colleges, adult education, go specifically and give grants or subsidies in subjects or qualifications where we need more people to move into to address skills shortages. Policy 3 then looks at lower direct taxes on workers. So I've put here, just as a means of a reminder, a direct tax is a tax on income and earnings. Remember that an indirect tax is a tax on consumption, a tax on goods and services. Direct tax is a tax on income, a tax on earnings. The most common one being income tax. The government may decide to reduce direct taxation to increase the incentives to work and invest, and thus enable the economy to increase its supply of goods and services. A number of individuals are put off by entering the labour market and are often put off by earning higher wages because they think the more I work, the longer I work, the higher the wage rate I get, the more the government will tax my income. And so if the government decide to lower the tax rates, people will get more take-home pay. So for example, if the government lowered my income tax, I would still get paid the same amount every month, but my disposable income, my income after tax has been deducted, would be much greater because I'm paying less tax. I would have more money to spend. By spending more money, I'm buying more goods and services. I've increased the demand for goods and services. Therefore, if demand rises, firms will supply more goods and services. So lowering the tax rate incentivizes people to work more hours. It incentivizes people to join the labour market. Lowering the income tax and employees' national insurance contribution can act as an incentive for unemployed workers to join the labour market, or for existing workers to work harder. So we look at those that haven't or maybe are currently on benefits, lower the direct taxes, and they may stop claiming benefits and then enter into the labour market because they'll earn more by working than what they would get on benefits. And for those that are already in the labour market, it's happy days. They're earning more disposable income. If the take-home pay after tax is greater than the benefits paid to an unemployed worker, this may act as an incentive for them to join the labour market. Reduced tax rates may encourage workers to seek promotions. So they may think, well, it may be worthwhile me getting a promotion because I'll earn more money and I'll have more take-home pay at the end of my working day. So evaluation of cutting direct taxes. Reduce revenue from taxation for government. If we reduce the rates of income tax, in the short run, it will reduce the amount of revenue governments get from taxation. And again, that might have an impact on fiscal policy. So this may affect the government's ability to fund government spending projects, such as policy 2, education and training. It depends upon the rate of decrease. So if the government said we're going to reduce income tax by 0.5%, well, in real terms, that's not a lot. Particularly if inflation or inflation is rising at something like 5%. If you cut income tax at 0.5%, well, you've saved me 0.5% on tax, but then the general rise in the prices of goods and services have risen by 5%. If the government said we're cutting income tax by 10%, well, gosh, that's quite a lot of money to be saving. So it depends upon how much they reduce income tax by. The rate of deduction needs to be enough to incentivize workers. If it's too small, the incentive function won't work. It has to be a decent enough figure to incentivize a large number of people to enter the labour market. Another thing there as well is that there has to be jobs for these individuals. So it's all well and good lowering the tax rates to encourage them into jobs, but there must be job creation. There must be jobs for those individuals to move into. Policy 4 looks at trade union reform. So when we look at trade union reform, we often look at weakening the power of the labour trade unions. Now, a trade union is an organization of workers set up to negotiate on wages, working hours, and working conditions with employers on behalf of its members. So we see examples of unions in the healthcare services, in education. A lot, trade unions are very heavily involved in public sector labor markets and public sector services. The trade union is there to defend the rights of the worker. They're there to make sure that the firm does not exploit the worker. However, one of the issues with governments have with trade unions is that they think trade unions are very powerful. Trade unions dictate to the government what wages should be. Trade unions will always fight for higher wages. Now, the danger with higher wages is that it increases the cost for firms, and it leads to wage inflation. It leads to higher wages. It could lead to inflationary pressure. Unionized labour frequently succeeds in securing high wage increases. If labour unions are weakened, wages will be more responsive to the forces of supply and demand, and will therefore be more likely to fall in the event that there is unemployment. By restricting the supply of workers, trade unions seek to increase the wages of their members, but at the cost of a decrease in the number employed. And the reason for that is that whenever you raise the wage rate, it incentivizes more people to join a labour market. However, on the flip side of that, it reduces the demand for labour because firms are having to pay more on wages. So firms are likely to make redundancies if it's costing them too much to employ workers. Supply-side economists would argue that such action increases costs, reduces efficiency, and reduces international competitiveness. In the UK, they are very heavily unionised. The unions very much so dictate the rate of productivity and the rate of growth within certain labour markets. Conservative government, particularly under Margaret Thatcher, pursue a vigorous supply-side policy aimed at reducing the power of trade unions in the labour market. I'm going to give you an example here of the coal miners' strike. So when we had the coal miners' strike in the 1970s, the history behind it was that the demand for coal was falling. So less people were burning coal than what they would have been in the past. So coal was the main way, an open fire was the main way of heating your house years ago. It was the main way of heating water. It was the main source of heat in many homes across the UK. London, for example, was nicknamed the Big Smoke because when you came down to London in the Victorian times, everybody had a fire burning to keep their houses warm. And so the sky was just constantly full of black smoke from coal. Coal gives off much blacker smoke. Less people were burning coal. More people were moving to more renewable sources of energy. Trains were no longer being fueled by coal. Large factories were no longer being fueled by coal. So the demand for coal was reducing. So therefore, labour being derived demand. If the demand for coal falls, the demand for labour that produces coal or extracts coal will also fall. So in the 1970s, a lot of coal mines were owned by the government. And the government looked at this, why are we funding a loss-making industry? Surely we should just need to close the thing down. So one by one, governments were gradually closing down coal mines. The unions, the coal miners' unions, did not want this. They did not want to lose their jobs. So they went out and strike. They fought to keep their pits open, and they fought against Margaret Thatcher. Now, unions then had considerable control. They were trying to bring down the government. Margaret Thatcher didn't like this. She didn't like the idea of somebody trying to pull down her government. So as a result, over the years, the government, and if you look at whenever a company goes on strike, productivity stops. The firms are not producing goods and services because the workers are not producing goods and services. So that gives you an example of how militant in some cases some of those miners were. Evaluation then of trade unions. Trade unions play an important part in protecting the rights and welfare of workers. They stop firms from exploiting work through low wages. Unions, even though the governments have over the years wanted to reduce their power. What unions have been very good at is that they're very good at protecting the rights of workers. They're very good at standing up for workers, particularly in industries where the employers abuse their trust. Employers are exploiting workers through things like poor working conditions and low wages. Trade unions will oppose policies to limit their powers. So if the government say you can't do this, the unions will fight against that. This will lead to industrial action, industrial disputes, and perhaps even industrial actions such as strikes. So people, you take, for example, nurses going on strike because of their pay, because of the working conditions, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. Policy 5, reducing business taxes. Now, every business has to pay tax. A tax on their earnings, if you remember before, a direct tax is a tax on earnings. Direct taxes can affect a firm's incentive to invest. So the main form of taxes are things like VAT, which would be an indirect tax, is a tax on producers of goods and services. But you've also got corporation tax as well, a tax on earnings, a tax on company profits. If you increase corporation tax, if corporation tax is high, firms will be less incentivized and they will be left with less funds with which to invest in order to expand. So firms are prevented from expanding because they've got less funds. If there are less profits to be made, firms may not be willing to take the risk of investment because it may be worth it or it may not be worth it. Multinational firms may be attracted to locations where corporation tax rates compare favorably with those in other countries. Such firms may be attracted to set up or expand in the UK, thus increasing productive capacity. So if we lower corporation tax, it incentivizes firms that are currently set up in the UK. It incentivizes those firms to invest more in their infrastructure, in their production. It encourages them to want to maybe invest in the latest up-to-date modern machinery and methods of production. If we keep corporation tax low in comparison with other countries, it will make the UK more attractive to set up business in. So we attract more foreign companies want to set up in the UK, and that brings with it a whole surge of benefits. So for example, increased employment, increased productivity, a larger number of goods and services produced. So that's all well and good, but the government may lose out on tax revenue. There's also no guarantee that firms will reinvest tax savings back into the business. They may simply use this as retained profit. They may give it to shareholders in the form of dividends. So if the government reduces corporation tax, that just basically means that firms will be earning more profits. They get to take more of their profits than what they would have done before, and they may just give them to shareholders. They may not be incentivized to want to reinvest back into. There's no guarantee. So the government may have to look at other methods, for example, maybe subsidizing firms to increase production or invest in better methods of production, in addition to reducing corporation tax. It also depends upon the rate of the tax deduction. So you take, for example, that last example I gave of making sure that the tax is in line with that of other countries. If we reduce our tax rates, but it's still nowhere near the competitive rate of corporation tax with other countries, then that still wouldn't be enough for governments to attract new firms into the UK. So it depends upon the rate of the tax deduction. Lastly, then, policy 6, which is looking at deregulation. Deregulation involves the elimination or reduction of government regulation control of the private sector activities and is based on the argument that government regulation stifles competition and increases inefficiency. So there is an argument that governments have too much involvement in the private sector. A lot of red tape, health and safety legislation, certain financial regulations, a lot of tax regulations, a lot of rules, laws, a lot of regulations that they must comply to. Red tape, bureaucracy, as we often refer to it as. Some economists would argue that too much rules and regulations and red tape, they stifle competition. They stop firms from growing. They stop firms from expanding. They stop firms from being as productive as they possibly can. In the past 2 to 3 decades, many countries have moved towards the removal of government regulations and hence economic deregulations. So the governments are less strict as what they were before. They're encouraging more movement of trade from one country to the next. There's less bureaucracy in the business world. A main form of deregulation has been to allow new private firms to enter the monopolistic and oligopolistic industries, thus forcing firms to face competition. So you take, for example, the Financial Services Authority supported the introduction of the Metro Bank into the banking industry. It provides another competitor in there, and that keeps all other firms in the industry. It keeps them on their toes. It makes them realize, look, we need to make sure we're offering the best quality of service of a good or service, so that because we now have new competition that could potentially steal our customers. The objective has been to increase efficiency, lower costs, and also improve quality. Industries affected include transport, airlines, television, broadcasting, telecommunications, natural gas, electricity, financial services, and others. If you think about it, and you wouldn't remember this, and I wouldn't remember it either, but when live TV first came into people's homes, you only had BBC, and that was channels 1 and channel 2. Now you've got ITV, you've got channel 4, you've got Sky, you've got a whole wealth of channels. Consumers now have more choice. Where there's more choice, that was brought about by deregulation. There's less rules and red tape over who can do what. So overall evaluation, how do they achieve government objectives? Supply side policies, they combat inflation. They help to reduce inflationary pressure in the long run because the product and labor markets become more efficient and productivity increases. If we experience a rise in the demand for goods and services, that will bring with it a rise in the supply of goods and services. So if we increase the supply side of the economy, that will be able to meet growing levels of demand, and that will stop rising prices. So supply is increasing along with the increase in demand. And so therefore everything's just simply increasing, shifting to the right, and prices are remaining stable. It increases employment. Labor is derived demand. It's derived from the demand of a good or service. As total demand for goods and services rises in an economy, more workers will be employed to meet this rise in demand. As labor productivity rises, this is likely to lead to a rise in real wage rates. So if we're seeing supply side policies like education and training, that is all designed to make people more educated, to make them more productive, but it's also designed to get people into the labor market. If anybody joins the labor market from they were once unemployed, now they have a job, they increase the levels of employment. And again, if you look at education training, it brings with it new business ideas. That brings with it a growth in the level of employment. Increased economic growth. As total supply in the economy increases, this means that economic growth has also been achieved. So if the government is successful in increasing the supply of the economy, they will also see an increase in economic growth. The country has grown, GDP has risen because there is an increase in the amount of goods and services produced. High quality of resources and rises in productivity make UK firms more competitive in price and quality. And so that helps to achieve a balance between the exports and imports, a stable balance of payments. Hopefully you've found that useful in helping you, giving you a whistle-stop tour of supply side policies. In your exam, you're likely to talk about different supply side policies that the governments could use, and you'd also have to evaluate each of those policies and give an overall recommendation as to how those policies would be best used to achieve government macroeconomic objectives. I hope you'll find that useful. Good luck in your exams.